This is Chigo. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
All right, good. With sincere apologies. I have used Zoom before, just in case you're wondering, but I think my internet's been a bit random at home today. But good afternoon, everyone. I think we've already got Cesar on the line.
Yes.
I think I saw you via video when I was trying to get in. Yeah?
That is correct.
Okay, great. Esther, Alana, I know you're there because I can't see you now. I'm going to just assume that I can kick things off, given that we've lost 7 minutes already. Is that all right?
Please
Yes.
do.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, so welcome everyone. This is one of our several really interesting conversations that we're having over this. I know today we've had a couple, and then there are a few coming up over the next couple of days, and this one is on taxation, of course. Excuse me. And this is really part and parcel of the work that the evaluation unit has been funding around evidence in governance and politics, so the EGAP network, which really sets out to conduct research on under-evidenced areas of governance and politics. And today, of course, we will talk about taxation. And as part of that EGAP network, really exciting work is an innovative method that they've developed called a Metaketa. And that is designed to answer some questions about what works across different country contexts. Now, I think there was a little note that also explained what the Metaketas are about, but they are really around, helping to coordinate a cluster of randomized control trials that try to test the same type of intervention across different places. So these experiments are really trying to understand whether an intervention that works in one context could work in another context. And alongside that, whether the role that context plays in an intervention contributes to either its success or failure. And I know, all of you will know that in governance, that's really at the nub of how we try to understand what some of that evidence tells us about what's workable or not workable. Today, our presenter, who will be looking at our taxation session, that's Cesar Zuko, who's an associate professor. I'm not going to try and pronounce the School of Public Administration, Cesar, in Brazil, but it's SGB EGAP in Brazil. And he's also a researcher with the EGAP network. Cesar participated in the Brazil taxation study. And aside from taxation, his research expertise is also on executive legislative relations, political parties, electoral politics, social policy, voting behavior, and measurement of ideology. So really, really fascinating skill set there. The way we will structure our conversation, I think the first thing I will just try and flag is our presentation and discussion is being recorded. So just a couple of housekeeping issues. And why we're doing this is so those who couldn't join us today could watch it later. So please just note that whenever you are contributing or speaking, you're consenting to be recorded. We have a Zoom chat function, which has already been activated. As you can see, the team sent through instructions for audio for those of us who are struggling to come in via video. Or you can also send any questions you have privately to Esther, who is collating them, and will also share with the whole, after the whole event, after the fact, for us to have a look and for others to also have some reflections on what you'd provided. So the way we're going to structure our conversation, we'll give Cesar about 40 minutes or so to run through his presentation, and he obviously won't just focus on Brazil, but he will be trying to draw together some of the key headlines of the lessons that findings emanated from, the other case studies, the other country case studies. So in this instance, we included Nigeria, DRC, Malawi, India, and Colombia. Then I will come in quickly to provide some quick, immediate reflections. And then we will go to what I think is quite an important and rich part of this conversation, which is the Q&A session, which will give about 30 minutes plus, but really an opportunity for you to raise both verbally, but also in writing via the chat or comments tab on anything that you might be wanting to raise or comment on. But a really fascinating outline of what we could learn a little bit about taxation and how it interacts with some of these important other governance dimensions in different contexts. All right, so Cesar, shall I pass that on to you to kick us off with the presentation, which I think from what I can see, Esther, correct me if I'm wrong, or Alana, we did receive that. I do have a copy of it, so colleagues will have sight of it, but I can see he can also load it on the screen. So Cesar, are you happy to kick us off?
Yes, thank you so much, Shigo, for the introduction. And you've already covered some of the materials that I will be talking about, so I can zoom past that part, which is great. Thank you very much for the opportunity of being here. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning to those that are in the morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I guess we're probably spanning many time zones in this chat this morning. So welcome to everybody. And I'm here on behalf of the 6 teams and the steering committee of the Metaketa 2 project, which was, as Chigo mentioned, on taxation. Just want to acknowledge the presence in the audience of Ana de la O, who's part of the steering committee, and Cyrus Semi, who's also director of the EGAP, not directly related to our study, but oversees all the Metaketa projects in general. I just want to stress, so I'll try to read out the number of the slides for those of you who are not seeing the shared screen. All slides are numbered except for the cover one. So I'll try to keep to that protocol as much as possible so that people can follow. If I deviate from that, I'll try to get back to it to make sure that everybody is literally on the same page. I want to, first thing, so I'm still on the cover slide, right? So I want to stress from the outset that even though this project is on taxation, that all the country studies and all the studies here deal with formalization. And formalization here, we are talking in a very broad sense, defined to include business registration, property rights, formal access to public provided services, and those are the ones we work with, but in principle, all realms of formalization. So one might ask, why would a project on taxation really dedicate itself so much to formalization? But it's a useful digression here is that as the project, from the project inception, it became clear that in the context of many developing countries, and especially the ones we were working with here, formalization is one very important path to taxation. It's not the only one. We can talk about taxation in different ways, but we found this common ground across all groups that were interested in studying this issue that would treat formalization as a proximate outcome of interest, with taxation being a downstream indirect effect of formalization. So we're looking at that path, and I'm going to come back to this issue again and again during the presentation because it's a very particular approach that was used in this Metaketa 2 project. So on to slide 1. I'll start just by presenting very, very briefly, even more briefly now that Chigo did the introduction, an overview of what EGAP is, what Metaketa initiative is, and where Metaketa 2, which is the one we're talking about, which I'm presenting today, how it fits in. I'll then move swiftly onto the specific problem of taxation and via formalization that we'll be talking about. And I'll stress the common intervention that was applied to all 6 studies. I'll get back to what that means in a few minutes. We'll then give you an overview of the 6 field projects, present the Metaketa analysis, the general findings, and then discuss some country-specific variations and possible policy implications that we can draw from the combined studies. So overview, slide 2, on to slide 3. So EGAP is a network of research and practitioners interested in supporting evidence-based policymaking. And this is done through a particular commitment to experimental research. 4, The Metaketa initiative is one of EGAP's activities. It's a project, as Chigo mentioned quickly earlier, that seeks to accumulate knowledge on specific topics through coordinated field experiments. So 5 rounds have been carried out or are in the field now. And these 5 rounds of Metaketas have covered these 19 countries highlighted in the map. Each of the 5 rounds, ours is the second, Metaketa 2, chooses a topic, such as our case taxation, and solicits individual projects from teams around the world. And once there is interest by the teams, there's a lot of discussion of how to harmonize, how to employ standardized practices in the field and measurements. And the idea is to generate knowledge that is cross-country, cross-context, and that can be published together and presented together to improve reliability and increase its impact. Slide 5. So I've already mentioned experiments twice, right, in this first 2 slides. And even though I'm sure this is common knowledge to most or many in this room, I think it's important to make a case very briefly for the importance of experiments in public policy. So experiments, in what we call experiments, basically probably better known in the policy world as RCTs, as also Chigo already anticipated. And they're the most reliable tool to determine whether intervention, which we usually think of in terms of a policy initiative that we want to test, evaluate, whether that has an actual effect on outcomes we want to affect in the world. So the key characteristics of this type of experiments that we employ is that the subjects or participants in the study, they have to be randomly assigned to different conditions. Emphasis on the random. Subjects assigned to what we call treatment conditions that receive the intervention, or it could be several treatment conditions, could be several interventions simultaneously. And then some other subjects are assigned to not receiving an intervention, to be in the control group. What we do then basically is to compare subjects in the treatment and the control conditions to see whether we observe differences in the outcomes that we are interested in. And the key thing here is that because the assignment to who is assigned to which condition is done randomly, all groups of individuals, the control group and any of the treatment groups, should on average be very, very similar across all background characteristics, observable and non-observable, that could influence the results, could influence the outcomes. This means that if we see the only relevant difference between the groups is that some were exposed to the intervention that we employed and others were not. And for that reason, we are allowed to conclude, if we observed outcomes that differ between groups in the end, that these differences in outcomes should probably be caused by the intervention. So that allows us to assess what kind of effects interventions had. So that's a standard RCT. So what's different about Metaketa? So Metaketa in general has this peculiarity that we perform RCTs that are very similar in terms of measurements, how we measure outcomes, how we implement interventions. So very similar RCTs are contemporaneously fielded in different locations. So they're done at more or less the same time in different settings, following very synchronized interventions and very synchronized and standardized measures of outcomes. This is the key thing. Now, why is this so innovative? Well, because most RCTs in the world are funded and conducted and designed independently by different teams of researchers. So even when they are on the same topics, sometimes it's really hard to generalize across the experiences that have been carried out in different, widely different contexts. So the Metaketa project is an attempt to coordinate these efforts so that we can perhaps have more comparable results and then draw more general lessons from what we learn from the field experiences. Slide 6. So with this coordinated cross-context studies, we expect to be able to provide better subsidy for policy-based, for evidence-based policymaking, as well as when we find something that works, that might generate us insights into how to scale up successful initiatives. So now to our specific intervention in policy problem. Okay. So we're talking, sorry, slide 8, perhaps. Firms that are not registered with the government in general account for about half of the economic activity in developing countries. That's one estimate from early in the century, 2010, more or less, early in the decade, but it should be, it's more or less an average across the developing world. So about half of the economic activity in developing countries is not registered with the government. More recent estimates from the OECD indicate that close to 40% of all economic activity in Latin America in particular comes from the informal sector. And there's reason to believe that that share is higher in Africa and some parts of Southern Asia. So informality in general means unregistered firms, it means unregistered workers, it means unregulated and sometimes illegal markets. So importantly, for the point of view of Metaketa 2, all these different types of informality mean uncollected taxes. So of course, it's not to say that the informal market does not collect any taxes, because there's indirect taxes, there's many other ways in which informal markets might generate some type of revenue for governments. But in general, as a blanket claim, we'd say that the higher informality is, smaller, and there's a smaller tax base, and there are weaker tax revenues for governments. So in the context of our developing countries that we are interested in, taxation is a distant outcome that requires first that we bring people in from the shadow economy, be it labor markets, be it markets for public goods, be it housing markets. You can think of informality in many different realms. So the premise of our project is that even though informality spans different realms of life, that there might be some kind of similar dynamics to try and bring people in from this informal markets to formal markets, be it registering firms, be it issuing property titles, be it formalizing access to public services. Slide 9. In this respect, I think it's interesting to refer back to the influential work of Hernando de Soto from the late 90s. And de Soto was mostly talking about formalization of housing, giving property rights to homeowners, and formalizing firms. So he was talking about two very specific realms of formalization. But what the one-liner that remains in people's minds from that work is that if we simply reduce the cost of formalization, which were very high for small and poor individuals in the developing world, and which essentially amount to red tape or excess regulation by governments, if we simply reduce that cost, reduce the barriers to entry, people would be flocking to the formal market. That would be enough to bring in all the shadow economy into the visible economy. So the idea here that's implicit here is that the informal sector really wants to be formal, and then there's just an excess of regulations, excess of state restrictions that prevent them from doing so. So here at Metaketa 2, however, we take a slightly wider, broader look on formality. Formalization really means different things across our individual sites, and I'll discuss this momentarily. But in each of our settings, we don't simply assume that everybody wants to formalize. And we don't simply assume that red tape is the only impediment to formalization. Instead, we break down the path from formalization to tax collection into a few discrete steps that are listed here in slide 9. So we can think about in terms of questions. We first ask whether people are interested in formalizing. Is there demand for becoming formal? And that's probably a lot of it's a cost benefit calculus by individuals. But then, once the benefit or the costs are established, are people willing to take the steps to actually formalize? Once they take the steps to formalize, does government allow them to formalize? Is it easy to do? Can you get it done? And once you're formal, do you actually comply with taxes? Slide 10. We can think of this sequence as just to make it clear, in terms of a type of ladder, a formalization taxation ladder. And we'll use this setup a few times in the talk today to kind of give a sense of what we mean by tax collection being a distant downstream effect of formalization, and this being a complex process. Our more nuanced approach highlights that not only there's a cost-benefit calculation by individuals, which can vary considerably across settings, but there's also a cost-benefit calculation from the government side, and there's also behavioral, possibly, issues involved in complying with taxes. So even if we reduce the costs of formalization, of information gathering, how to navigate the process of formalization, there might not be, individuals might choose not to become formal. When they choose to become formal, when they choose to demand it, they might not succeed in navigating the process. And when they succeed in navigating the process and becoming officially formalized in that specific realm, they might not maintain tax compliance further down the line. So something that was a very simple, reduced cost that people will come type of argument in DeSoto becomes a much more nuanced, stepwise sequence of events that we, in our context. And the interesting thing for us, and I think we'll come back to this at the end of the talk, is that depending on where this process breaks down, depending on what part of this chain is does not follow through, the policy prescriptions, the policy remedies will probably differ. So the simple fact that you have low formalization and low tax collection in the end, which could characterize all the cases that we're looking at, might actually be caused by different problems along the way. And each of these different problems might have a different policy remedy. Slide 11 is projects, and I'll talk a little bit about the projects and before we go into the meat and bones. Okay. So the Metaketa 2 project initiative had 6 sites, was already quickly mentioned: Colombia, Brazil, Nigeria, DRC, Congo, Malawi, and India. This was selected after an initial call that included many more countries, and the steering committee organized studies that were compatible among themselves to generate this setup. Each of the teams met early in the project to define standardized interventions and standardized measures of outcome, which is a key characteristic of Metaketa. So what are these standardized elements of the context of the studies? So remember that formalization can mean different things across these sites. So that wasn't standardized. We were talking about different realms of formalization. What was standardized was the general question, the general intervention, and how we measure the outcomes. So the first obvious standardized or harmonized issue across studies was the question. So the main question, empirical question, was whether reducing the transaction costs for formalization increased demand for formalization, ultimately tax compliance. So all studies had the common intervention, which is the main focus of this talk. As an aside, some studies also did other randomized interventions, and so I might bring a few of these insights from these other interventions later on in the discussion, but the main focus of the talk is this very simple standardized intervention that I'll describe now, which consisted essentially of in-person visits to individuals with at their place of work or the place of living that would provide information about costs and benefits in the process of how to formalize in the specific realm being addressed. And in all cases, this is also very important, there was an offer for technical assistance in navigating the actual process of formalization. And if an individual said, oh yes, I want to do this, please help me with it, we would have follow-up meetings and follow-up help so that the person that was interested, we didn't force this upon anybody, but when individuals sought it, all the teams provided the help to try to get people to the end of the process of formalization and into the process of tax compliance. So each of these studies, each of the 6 studies, each one was an RCT in its own right. So all the results, everything we get from here are from comparisons between the treated units, the ones that received this intervention, the ones that received the visit and the assistance, compared against those who did not, who were in the control group, who were just measured at baseline and measured at end line, but did not receive the intervention. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the one important key is that the way in which we measure the outcomes and the outcomes of interest were also harmonized in the 6 sites. We work with 3 outcomes that follow essentially the ladder I showed a couple slides ago. So we measure intent to formalize, we measure formalization, and we measure tax compliance. So here, their key theoretical point already anticipated is that because we separate the complex outcome of formalization into these 3 steps, we want to claim that this allows us to look into how individuals are thinking and how governments are acting, not only treating this as a simple decision by individuals to say, hey, I want to formalize, right? So we don't really manipulate what governments do. So the government reaction is not an experimental part of the study, but because we break down the study, the outcomes into these 3 different steps, we are able to implicitly infer whether government's action and what the government cost benefit calculus, how that affects the process. And I'll get back to this when we get to the results, but I think this is an important point. So we're not looking at one outcome, even though we're interested in taxation in the long run, we're breaking this down into a chain of events that go to intention to formalize, formalize, and eventually comply with taxes. Is slide 14. So I already said a couple of times that the realms of formalization, what formalization mean in each of these studies, is not necessarily the same. We did not harmonize that part. But it's interesting to see that we have some variation in what formalization meant across each of our sites. In Brazil, Colombia, and Nigeria, we're talking about essentially formalization of small firms. I'll give you a little more detail in the next few slides. In the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which I'll refer to simply as DRC, it's formalizing housing and land, it's property titles in urban settings. In India and Malawi, it was formalizing the provision and access to public services. In India, it was water. In Malawi, it was tax collection. It was trash collection through contributions to the local government. So as I progress quickly through the slides, next few slides, just to show you what the cases are, keep in mind that the interventions were the same, very similar across all cases, right? They were all implied information session with an offer to formalize. What varies a little bit is the realm and the setting. So in Brazil, the idea, the formalization setting was to try to get individuals that were micro-entrepreneurs in favelas to sign up to a federal government's program for that offers subsidized contributions to Social Security and also offers business benefits for the firms that formalize. So it's a formalization program that gives the firms benefits and also gives its entrepreneurs access to Social Security. It's called the MAE program. In Colombia, the intervention was very similar and the realm was very similar. It was also to attempt to get small, informal firms from the suburbs of Bogota out of the shadows and become formal. But the program in Colombia did not offer Social Security benefits. It offers only firm benefits. So the firm can issue receipts. It can operate free from harassment. It can sell to the government and things like that. In Nigeria, it was also formalization of firms, but in this case, they were market vendors. And they had the opportunity to apply for an electronic tax certificate, which would presumably allow them to be free from harassment from the government, because it would be a sign that they're complying with taxes and they can execute their commerce in legal basis. Now I'm in 18, sorry. In the DRC, the idea was to get individuals to obtain a property title, one type of property title for their living conditions, so their home and their plot of land where their home is located. The government issued a program that reduced considerably the costs of getting different types of land titles. And the idea here was to take advantage of this special program with the reduced costs and get individuals to formalize the title to their land and to their where their homes are, and thus probably increasing the value of their property. In slide 19, in India, the idea was to get slum residents to request formal water connection following a legal decision that prevented the government from denying water connections to individuals whose homes were in illegal settlements. So after that legal decision, the dwellers in slums could request formal water connections, and those could no longer be denied by the government. So the idea was to help individuals that were interested in this navigate the very complex process to obtain access to those services and then subsequently pay. In slide 20, which is Malawi, the idea here was to get individuals to pay their city fees, which are city taxes. Part of the intervention was to show that it was worth paying the city fees by first providing trash collection to everybody, so that people would realize, hey, there's something interesting here. If we pay, we might get a service. So there was information sessions that were carried out showing that that service would only be made available, and other services would only be made available if people actually paid their city fees. So the information sessions try to show the importance of paying their city fees with a concrete example of trash collection. And then the idea was to see whether people would actually join and pay their fees and regularize their existence in the city. So slide 21 and 22 now, I'm going to turn to the quantitative results of what we find in each of these cases. Remember, each of these cases is an RCT. So we'll talk about how the treatment, which is providing the information session, providing the assistance, increased into intent to formalize in that specific realm, formalizing compliant taxes, or did not, right? We'll show you this in a second. But before we progress to the actual results, it's worth coming back to our ladder of formalization taxation to anticipate the results, give you an overview before we go into the specifics. So the results here, if we look from the bottom up, okay, from the bottom of the slide up, we'll see that as we'll see in a second, in Nigeria, Malawi, and in Colombia, the interventions that we provided did not actually increase intent to formalize. So in this case, we'll discuss later how we interpret this, but the cost benefit calculation, even after people receive the information, so that's discounting the hassle of finding out about how the process works, because we're giving that to people, and we're also helping them to navigate through the process. So we're reducing the cost dramatically. Even after reducing the cost dramatically, there was not particular interest in formalizing in Nigeria, Malawi, and Colombia. In Brazil, DRC, and India, we did find some increase. In India and DRC in particular, as we'll also see, individuals tried, but oftentimes did not succeed in formalizing for a few different reasons, and we'll talk about what that tells us about how the state operates. Even despite these obstacles in DRC, both in Brazil and DRC, we did find some increase in formalization, but only in Brazil did we find some increase in compliance. So these are some varied results, and I'll show you the numbers in a second, and then we go back to how we interpret them and what can we learn from them. So slide 24. So the first set of results here is for intent in formalizing. So intent formalizing was measured slightly in the most similar way possible across cases. So it basically meant taking some action or declaring interest in formalizing. Starting the process, saying that you want to start the process. So it's a combination of both what people did and what people said, depending on the context. We don't have this measure for Nigeria yet. We will have by the end of the study. There was a small issue with the way they measure this, but it's on the works. But for the other 5 cases, we have the results. All the differences I'm going to show you, there are differences in proportions. So here for the DRC, for instance, we have that there were 30 percentage points more individuals that declared interest to formalize among the treatment group than in the control group. In India, that was 11 percentage points. In Brazil, that was 5 percentage points. The stars measured our statistical certainty. How sure can we be that these are not zero given the variance in the data? Just to give you an idea, so a 30 percentage point increase is a very large increase in DRC. It's a smaller increase in India. It's a much smaller increase in Brazil, but the baseline in Brazil, people were already interested beforehand. So it's hard to increase that further because there was a lot of interest beforehand. But still, what we can point out is that in Colombia and Malawi, and to the extent that we can say in Nigeria, even though we don't have the data, there was no evidence that people had interest in formalizing, even when we reduced the cost substantially of doing so. Okay. Slide 25. This is actual formalization. So the previous one was intent to formalize. Here it's formalization, which is finalizing the initial formalization process, obtaining a business license in the 3 countries where that was the realm, obtaining a land title in DRC, and paying the city fees in Malawi, and getting access to water in India. And here we see different results. So we have both in the DRC and in Brazil, we have about 7 or 8 percentage points more formalization among the treatment group, those that received the information session and the assistance, than others. In India, if you go back and recall, there was a lot of interest in formalizing, 11 percentage points more, but there was essentially no difference in the formalization rates between the treatment and control group. And even in the DRC, where we had a 30 percentage point increase in the intent to formalize, once we get to formalization in slide 25, this intent to formalize does not materialize, right? So this big slippage in DRC and India is interesting because it suggests to us that the cost benefit calculation was positive for individuals, but that the state or the process or the bureaucracy did not allow people to get to the end of the process, right? And I'll get back to this in a second. So in slide 26, which is for tax compliance, we see that essentially there's no effect in any of the countries except for Brazil, where you did see an increase in tax compliance in about 5 percentage points. Remember, just to make a note here, in Brazil, that it's a really simple process to pay. You can schedule payments in advance. It can do it all online, so it's fairly easy. So slide 27. So essentially what the results shows that it's really hard to get to increase taxation through the route of formalization. So it's not just reduce the cost and they will come. There's many ways in which this process breaks down. And it's interesting to see that the process seems to break down in different points across different studies. So in some sense, the variation in the outcomes here is probably more interesting than the average effects we find across the cases. In Brazil, DRC, and India, it suggests that the cost-benefit calculation itself is favorable because people have interest and they attempt the process, but there's something down the line that makes it hard. People get all the way to tax compliance. In Malawi, Colombia, and Nigeria, probably not. The tax benefit was not that interesting. And we will now delve into the cases a little bit to get some further insight. Okay, so not all interventions succeeded in increasing not all interventions to generate interest in formalization were equally effective. And I think Nigeria and the Malawi cases kind of are nice examples of what happened, what might have happened. So what these cases tell us, among other things, is they uncover weak latent demand. So in the case of Nigeria, some people would even do the process, pay the fees, and not pick up the certificate, not go for the result. Part of it is probably that the individuals did not see much advantage. Now, why did individuals not see much advantage in formalizing? Probably, and here's an important point here, is that there were, for some cases, there are more trusted alternatives outside the state in the informal market than the state. There's market associations in Nigeria had a history of providing services and helping individuals in case of need, whereas in contrast, state had a really weak presence. Individuals don't run into the state in any realm in their life. They're not used to obtaining state services in any other aspect, so they don't really consider the state important or a reasonable provider of services. So in this sense, state is not credible as a provider of any advantage. Individuals rather stay in the informal sector where they're already used to operating. That's a lesson from Nigeria. In Malawi, it's also interesting that even though people liked the trash collection, apparently from the qualitative evidence, they didn't like it enough to pay for it because they could simply toss the rubbish into the river, and they didn't see much use into starting to pay taxes to get a service that they didn't particularly value. In addition to this, paying taxes in exchange for general services, not in a direct quid pro quo, also generates the collective action problems. Individual would think, well, others will pay, and I'll still take advantage of the trash bins, of the trash collection. In that sense, why should I pay? The trash collection was not a good example to get people to pay their general taxes because they thought they could easily free ride on that aspect. So there was no direct selective incentives for individuals, and that seemed to be lacking. So what these two studies kind of point to us is that we have to consider the alternatives to formalization in the informal, how individuals are doing in the informal sector. So there has to be a cross-benefit calculation, and an important point from that's highlighted from the Nigeria study is that if individuals are well plugged into the clientelistic networks or ethnic networks that provide protection and provide help in the informal markets, they might not have an incentive to switch to the state. Maybe individuals that are not included in the informal have bad options in the informal sector. Some follow-up studies in Nigeria suggest that those were more likely to respond to the formalization attempt, but the ones that are doing fairly well in the informal market will not. So there's also an issue of credibility for individuals that were excluded from protection from the clientelistic networks. When we had state actors do the assistance and do the information sessions, there seemed to be a response. This is from secondary treatment arms. So in that sense, the very specific context of what individuals can get in the informal sector seems to have a very big effect on how they react to the attempts to bring them into the formal sector. So just talk quickly here now about comparison between the Brazil and Colombia cases. And the interesting thing here is that in these two cases, the parallels are very strong. There were very similar interventions, but in Brazil, we succeeded in getting individuals to become interested and to eventually formalize, and in Colombia did not. What the key thing that emerged to us from the qualitative part of our study is that what really individuals are really interested in was the Social Security benefits. And there was a lot of arguments of the sort, oh, nobody ever asked for a receipt. There has never been a government agent here to say that I need to issue a receipt. So individuals, even operating in the informal market, except for the more structured ones, they could go on forever without really having to interface with the formal market. So for them, the business side of the business incentives were not that big. Now, when they understood that you could get Social Security benefits and Social Security protection by paying these small fees, that seemed to make a big difference. So there was the selective incentives more than the general business incentives that were driving individuals' interest. And we also found that intervention sections did increase people's information. So it's not that people are doing an uninformed decision. People got information, but they, if it's not in the case of Brazil, in other cases, sometimes they're just not interested in because they do the cost benefit analysis and they realize it's not for them. So that's the case in Colombia. Individuals learned, they knew what they had to, what were the issues involved in becoming formal or not. They just did not see a large enough benefit because in Colombia, there were no Social Security benefits. There were simply business benefits. You could run your business free of harassment and interface with the formal market, but that was not attractive enough. So what these cases show us that in both cases, you had a relatively easy process that could be done online and quickly. So there's not food, you don't have to interface. There's not a lot of foot dragging by the government. There were very similar interventions, but in some individuals, just the calculus was not, did not pen towards formalization in Colombia. But Colombia has a secondary treatment arm that we are not discussing here, that when the research team provided a bigger benefit, providing training sessions and teaching sessions about how to run your business for individuals, in addition to what the advantage of being formalized, these additional benefits seem to draw more people into the formal and into actually formalizing. So it reinforces the idea that the size of the benefit, the selective incentives that individuals can receive as a quid pro quo, direct quid pro quo from taxation, when that's visible to them, they are willing sometimes to change their cost benefit calculus and go into and accept to enter the formal market. So what's in it for me is a very relevant question in these scenarios. In Brazil, we also found compliance with taxes, and we have evidence to believe that that's actually, when you get to that point, behavioral issues about making it easy for people to pay, reminding people to pay, make a lot of difference. But those things only make a difference once people already made it all the way through the ladder and they have already decided to formalize. And once they're up there, then all the behavioral dynamics might kick in, and I'll leave that for Q&A. So some interventions increase the demand for formalization, but then we see a resistance from the government side. And this is very particularly strong in DRC and in India. In the DRC, individuals had to request a visit so that the surveyor would come, determine whether their land would be eligible for the formalization process. And so it's a very complex process. A lot of individuals did do that part. This really seemed interesting. But then suddenly the government did not uphold the reduced prices and fees that they had promised to do. And it turns out that that was a disalignment between the central government and the local government, because the local government suddenly realized that they would have to stop taking bribes for the kind of services that, of property regularization that they used to in the past. So at some point, local government simply reneged on saying, no, we're not going to do this, even though it was a mandate from higher up. So it took a lot of re-coordination by the team with the two levels of government to make sure that the government would follow through. But this highlights the idea that sometimes the tax authority has an idea of bringing people in to increase the tax base, but the local street level bureaucrats do not. They lose from that, or they're not interested in following through, they're not interested in complying with it. And a similar situation, but for different reasons, was found in India, where there was clearly strong demand. People in the informal market have terrible quality water, very expensive. So they're willing to pay and go through the process to get water. But it turns out that the process is very long and very complicated for bureaucrats. There's several different offices that have to agree with this. And then come election time, all these individuals in the government are put to work for elections and to try to get re-elections and work for something else. And the process basically stalls. So it's the bureaucrats, again, don't have an incentive, not necessarily due to bribe taking, but due to the fact that they have the other demands to follow through with the process. So streamlining the bureaucracy of that process would make a big difference in the case of it. So towards a wrap up, so on slide 42 and 43. So we did find that in some cases, there's interest in formalization. In some cases, even though there's interest, the government drags its foot and is the main impediment. And at some point, if people get through the whole process, we have a whole different set of issues of having people remember to pay and being able to pay regularly their taxes. So what does this tell us? So on slide 44, we go back to Alada one last time to think about what these results, what different the variation results might tell us. So if we start from the bottom again, and we see that we ask ourselves, is there demand for formalization? So we reduce the costs, we give people information, and not everybody formalizes. Not everybody's interested in formalizing. So a few things that our studies seem to indicate is that tangible individual benefits that people associate correctly or erroneously with the payment of with becoming formal make a big difference. So sometimes, and these things don't have to be really necessarily related to the realm of formalization one is working with. So if you think about Brazil, formalizing a small firm is not obviously related with getting social security benefits for the individuals. But if you add that to the equation, people are willing to formalize their firms. So you could selective incentives could be from a different realm, but people have to see that there's some advantage in what they're doing, and just leaving it for a general increase in public services probably will lead to collective action problems and won't get people to formalize. You could reduce the process, reduce the costs even further. You could deal with the collective action problems, which we were talking about. Find a way to prevent people from free riding, so they realize that if they don't pay, they don't get the service. Would be the equivalent of putting locks on the trash bins in the Malawi case. Or you could one thing important to do is to consider which are the individuals who are currently not getting a reasonable service from the informal market, right? So if you're part of an ethnic majority that has a very strong organization in that setting, individuals might be fine not formalizing, but perhaps the group that is left out, or it's a minority group, those would be willing to seek protection from the state. So thinking about these conditions might lead to specific interventions that would increase intent to formalize. So if people have intent to formalize, now in the middle step here, but they're not being able to formalize, here the lessons are very stark and clear. I think the DRC and the India cases point to this. One is to make sure there's an alignment between the tax agencies that are wanting to increase taxation and increase the tax base and the street level bureaucrats who have to interface with individuals. There has to be an incentive for the local offices to operate. Otherwise, there's a agency problem inside the state that will simply make it really hard for individuals to get through the other side of the process. One possible solution here is to improve the technology of how this is done. So both in Brazil and Colombia, it was done almost entirely online, where individuals would hardly ever need to actually access a bureaucrat directly, a street level bureaucrat. So that reduces the burden, the administrative burden on the government side of implementing these formalization processes. So some of them might be able to go that route, and that might be a really useful route in some conditions. And towards the end, if individuals get to the point that they formalize, but then they are not complying with taxes, here we have a different set of tools that could be useful. One is, and this comes from research that we're doing, that simple behavioral insights into making it really easy for people to comply with taxes, making it easy for them to do it regularly, making it easy for them to do the calculations, so that simplifying flat taxes as much as possible so that people can comply online, can comply through the phone or some other way like that. That would probably help. The behavioral part of it would probably kick in up here once people are already formal. Obviously, there's all the other issues of enforcement and everything else that's already in the literature in formalization, but these things seem to only become relevant once you're up here, because if you're not up there yet, there's no point in. It's really hard to do the enforcement, really hard to come up with behavioral aspects, because people are simply not part of this system yet, and they don't think they need to be part of the system. So that leads us towards the end. So I'm wrapping up now at slide 45. We examined whether reducing the transaction costs would increase formalization, intent to formalize formalization, and ultimately compliance. This was a multi-site study across 6 different places with harmonized interventions and outcome measurements. We find that tangible benefits are very important to get people to formalize, that there's a government side of this that's typically overlooked in the literature. It's not only getting individuals to do the cost-benefit analysis, make sure that the government solves its interagency problem, and that the street-level bureaucrats are on the same page as tax collection agencies. And these two sides of the question of the issue, how individuals are doing their cost-benefit analysis and how governments are operating, are both crucial in order to get individuals from the informal market into the tax collection, into providing tax revenues for the state. And that's it. I'm wrapping up. I think I'm more or less on time, though I did not start my watch exactly right, so maybe it's slightly over. I apologize for that.
Thanks, Cesar.